I'm a sports medicine doctor at Meridian Peak Medical Center in Boulder, Colorado, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 3 weeks ago. You can call me Dr. Adrienne Blackwood if you want. Though most people in the sports medicine department just called me the bone whisperer. During my 21 years there, I've seen everything you can imagine in sports medicine: torn ACLs that ended Olympic dreams in a single misstep, compound fractures that turned promising careers into cautionary tales told in medical textbooks, career-ending concussions that left brilliant athletes struggling to remember their own children's names, cervical spine injuries that transformed world-class runners into wheelchair-bound shadows of their former selves, and every conceivable kind of trauma the human body can endure when pushed beyond its absolute physical and psychological limits. I've worked with Olympic gold medalists whose names are household words, professional basketball players whose salaries could buy small countries, elite rock climbers who dance with death on vertical walls of granite, Paralympic champions who redefined what human determination looks like, marathon world record holders who run faster than most people can drive through school zones, and weekend warriors who thought a few beers and 20 years of couch sitting made them invincible against gravity and physics. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about human physiology, the fundamental limits of medical science, the very nature of life and death, the boundaries between possible and impossible, and ultimately led me to walk away from sports medicine entirely after dedicating more than 2 decades of my life to this field. It's a case that still wakes me up at 3:17 a.m. in cold sweats, my heart pounding like I've just sprinted up a mountain, not because of the graphic nature of what I witnessed. I've seen plenty of blood and bone and torn flesh in my career, but because of what happened afterward that should have been medically, scientifically, and biologically impossible, according to every textbook I'd ever studied, every case I'd ever treated, every principle of human anatomy and physiology that forms the bedrock of modern medicine. Meridian Peak Medical Center is widely regarded as one of the most prestigious and technologically advanced sports medicine facilities in the entire Rocky Mountain region, serving professional teams from Denver, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, and Las Vegas, along with Olympic training centers scattered throughout Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, elite mountaineering expeditions that attempt the world's most dangerous peaks, and some of the most accomplished and driven athletes in the world. The facility is a testament to what unlimited funding and cutting-edge medical technology can accomplish when combined with the desperate need to keep multi-million-dollar athletes performing at peak levels year after year. It's a cutting-edge facility that would make most major hospitals jealous, equipped with the most advanced imaging technology that money can buy, multiple 3 Tesla MRI machines that can capture images so detailed you can see individual muscle fibers, real-time ultrasound systems that show blood flow in vessels smaller than human hair, force plate analysis equipment that measures ground reaction forces down to the gram, specialized rehabilitation robotics that can simulate any sport-specific movement pattern, hyperbaric oxygen chambers that accelerate healing at the cellular level, anti-gravity treadmills that allow athletes to train while injured, and a team of world-renowned specialists who handle some of the most complex, challenging, and career-defining athletic injuries you could possibly imagine. The facility sits majestically at 5,400 feet above sea level, nestled against the breathtaking backdrop of the Colorado Rockies, with peaks that scrape the sky at over 14,000 feet, then serves as an absolute mecca for athletes who push their bodies to extremes that most people can't even comprehend in their wildest nightmares or most ambitious dreams. We see ice climbers who survive falls of hundreds of feet down frozen waterfalls, mountain bikers who launch themselves off cliffs that would terrify base jumpers, downhill skiers who hit trees at 60 miles per hour and somehow live to tell about it, rock climbers whose safety ropes snap at the most crucial moments, when they're hanging thousands of feet above certain death, ultra-endurance athletes who literally run their bodies into complete systemic failure, pursuing records that exist at the very knife's edge of human capability and survival. The Colorado location isn't coincidental, it's strategic. The high-altitude training environment, combined with year-round access to world-class skiing, climbing, hiking, and cycling, makes Boulder a natural gathering place for athletes who specialize in sports that most reasonable people would classify as barely controlled suicide attempts. The thin air at altitude forces physiological adaptations that enhance performance at sea level, but it also creates unique medical challenges that require specialized knowledge and equipment that simply doesn't exist at most medical facilities. During my 21 years at Meridian Peak, I personally consulted on over 8,000 individual cases, and that's not counting the routine follow-ups, second opinions, and collaborative consultations that probably push the real number closer to 15,000 patient interactions. These ranged from seemingly routine muscle strains that turned out to be harboring career-threatening complications, to stress fractures in Olympic athletes whose bone density had been compromised by years of extreme training regimens, to catastrophic multi-system trauma that ended promising careers in the space of milliseconds and changed not just the athlete's life, but the lives of their families, coaches, sponsors, and sometimes entire communities that had rallied around their success. I've been the doctor who sat across a polished conference table from 22-year-old Olympic hopefuls, kids who had sacrificed their entire childhoods, their education, their social development, their relationships with family and friends, and delivered the soul-crushing news that they would never compete again at any level, let alone the Olympics they had dreamed about since they were 5 years old. I've held the trembling hands of professional athletes earning millions of dollars per year as they sobbed uncontrollably upon learning that their bodies could no longer perform the precise, demanding movements that had not only defined their entire identity since childhood, but also supported their families, their communities, and their sense of self-worth. I've delivered the kind of devastating medical news that doesn't just end careers, it shatters dreams that took decades to build, destroys identities that had been carefully crafted since early childhood, eliminates income streams that supported extended families, and forces people to completely reimagine who they are and what their life will become when the thing that made them special, that made them valuable, that made them who they are, is suddenly and permanently taken away by the cruel mathematics of physics applied to human tissue. But I've also been extraordinarily privileged to witness miraculous recoveries that defied every medical prediction I made, every statistical model I applied, every evidence-based protocol I recommended. I've seen athletes return to elite-level competition after injuries that should have ended their careers permanently, injuries that other doctors had declared completely unsurvivable from a performance standpoint. I've watched human determination combine with cutting-edge medical intervention to achieve outcomes that seemed absolutely impossible when I first examined the patient and reviewed their imaging studies. I've been part of rehabilitation programs that pushed far beyond the boundaries of what we thought the human body could recover from and adapt to under even the most optimal circumstances. I've seen teenagers with spinal cord injuries learn to walk again when every textbook said they never would. I've watched middle-aged marathon runners return to competitive racing after cardiac events that should have ended not just their running careers, but their lives. I've been involved in experimental treatments that seemed like science fiction, but produced results that made front-page news in medical journals around the world. I deliberately specialized in what we somewhat arrogantly called impossible cases within the sports medicine community. The injuries so severe, so complex, so devastating, so unprecedented, that other medical centers, including some of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, would transfer patients to us as an absolute last resort, when they had exhausted all other options and needed someone willing to attempt treatments that existed at the very edge of medical possibility. My reputation was built methodically, case by case, over decades of taking athletes who had been essentially written off by other doctors and no further treatment options, and finding innovative ways to get them back to some meaningful version of their former selves. Sometimes that meant returning to elite competition at the same level they had achieved before their injury. Sometimes it meant stepping down to recreational participation, but still being able to experience the joy and identity that came from their sport. Sometimes it meant simply being able to walk without assistance, climb stairs without pain, or sleep through the night without medication. But in almost every case, regardless of the specific outcome, it meant giving people back fundamental pieces of their lives that other medical professionals, highly qualified and well-intentioned doctors, had declared permanently and irretrievably lost. It meant restoring hope where none had existed. It meant finding solutions that hadn't been attempted before. It meant pushing the boundaries of what was considered medically possible. My approach to these impossible cases was methodical, rigorously scientific, and grounded in decades of evidence-based medicine, combined with a willingness to think creatively when established protocols proved insufficient. I believed absolutely in the power of advanced medical imaging to reveal the true extent and nature of injuries with unprecedented precision. I trusted completely in biomechanical analysis to predict recovery timelines and identify the most efficient rehabilitation pathways. I relied heavily on established peer-reviewed protocols for tissue healing, bone regeneration, and neural adaptation that had been validated through thousands of cases and millions of patient hours of data. I had developed rehabilitation programs that were studied, replicated, and implemented at major medical centers around the world. Sports medicine physicians from 6 continents had traveled to Boulder specifically to observe my techniques, learn my protocols, and understand my approach to cases that other doctors considered hopeless. My methods had been featured in major medical conferences, written up in peer-reviewed journals, and incorporated into medical school curricula. The human body, while remarkably resilient and adaptable in ways that continue to surprise and inspire me, operates within certain predictable biological parameters that I had come to understand with almost mathematical precision over my 2 decades of intensive practice. Bones heal at specific, calculable rates that can be predicted based on the patient's age, nutritional status, hormonal profile, injury severity, compliance with treatment protocols, and a dozen other measurable variables. Muscles regenerate according to well-understood cellular processes that follow established timelines governed by protein synthesis, blood flow, neural innervation, and mechanical loading patterns. Ligaments and tendons repair themselves through collagen synthesis that occurs in predictable phases: inflammation, proliferation, and remodeling, each with its own timeline and requirements for optimal healing. Neural pathways damaged by trauma follow established patterns of either recovery through neuroplasticity and adaptive reorganization, or permanent deficit based on the precise location, extent, and nature of the damage. Cardiovascular adaptations to training and detraining occur according to principles that have been studied and quantified for over a century. I had become widely recognized as an expert in these biological timelines, these physiological constants that govern human recovery and adaptation. Colleagues from around the world would consult with me specifically because I could look at an MRI scan, analyze blood work, review biomechanical studies, and predict with remarkable accuracy how long a rehabilitation would take, what functional limitations might remain permanently, what realistic goals should be set for each individual patient, and what the long-term prognosis looked like, not just for return to sport, but for quality of life over decades. My colleagues often joked, with a mixture of admiration and mild annoyance, that I could predict recovery timelines down to the week, and they weren't entirely wrong. I had developed mathematical models that incorporated dozens of variables to generate recovery predictions that proved accurate in over 90% of cases. Insurance companies relied on my assessments to determine coverage for long-term rehabilitation. Professional teams used my timelines to make personnel decisions worth millions of dollars. Olympic committees requested my input to determine whether investing in an injured athlete's rehabilitation was worthwhile given the timeline to major competitions. This expertise, this deep and comprehensive understanding of human physiology and biomechanics, this ability to see patterns and predict outcomes that other doctors missed, had made me one of the most sought-after sports medicine physicians in the country. Professional teams flew me across the continent to consult on their most challenging and expensive cases. Olympic committees from multiple countries retained me as a consultant for athletes whose careers and medal prospects hung in the balance. Medical insurance companies hired me to evaluate cases where hundreds of thousands of dollars in treatment costs needed to be justified. I had authored over 150 peer-reviewed research papers, published in the most prestigious medical journals in the world, contributed entire chapters to major medical textbooks that are used in medical schools globally, and delivered keynote presentations at international conferences attended by thousands of physicians. My research had been cited in over 3,000 other scientific papers, and my protocols had been implemented at medical centers in over 40 countries. My work had been featured in major medical journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, and the Journal of the American Medical Association. I had been recognized with numerous professional awards, including the American College of Sports Medicine's highest honor for contributions to the field, the International Olympic Committee's Award for Medical Excellence, and the American Medical Association's recognition for innovative treatment protocols. I served on the editorial boards of 3 major medical journals, frequently reviewing research submissions from colleagues around the world, and helping to shape the future direction of sports medicine research. I was regularly called upon to provide expert testimony in legal cases involving athletic injuries, medical malpractice claims, and insurance disputes. My opinions carried weight not just in medical circles, but in courtrooms, boardrooms, and Olympic training facilities around the globe. But more importantly than any professional recognition achievement, I had helped thousands of athletes return to the sports they loved, with a passion that most people reserve for family and faith. I had been part of comeback stories that made national news, and inspired millions of people facing their own seemingly insurmountable challenges. I had participated in rehabilitation successes that defied medical predictions, and became the subject of documentaries, books, and motivational speaking tours. I had seen the human spirit triumph over seemingly insurmountable physical obstacles in ways that redefined my understanding of what people are capable of when they refuse to accept limitations. I had played a crucial role in making those triumphs possible, in providing the medical expertise and innovative thinking that transformed impossible dreams into documented reality. I thought I had seen it all. After 21 years of pushing the boundaries of sports medicine, of taking on cases that other doctors wouldn't touch, of developing new treatments and protocols that expanded what we considered medically possible, I believed there were no surprises left for me in this field. I was confident that my understanding of human anatomy, physiology, and recovery was as comprehensive and complete as human knowledge allowed. I trusted implicitly in the scientific method, in evidence-based medicine, in peer review, and in the predictable biological processes that govern how our bodies heal, adapt, and respond to injury and treatment. I had built my entire career on the foundation that while medicine might involve art and intuition, at its core it was a science governed by discoverable laws and predictable patterns. That confidence, that certainty in my medical knowledge and experience, that unwavering faith in the limits and possibilities of human physiology, that trust in the scientific principles that had guided every decision I had made for over 2 decades, would be completely and irreversibly shattered by what I witnessed during one impossible week in March 2024. It was a case that challenged not just everything I understood about human anatomy and recovery, but everything I believed about the very nature of what separates the living from the dead. the functional from the permanently disabled, the possible from the scientifically impossible. It was a case that would force me to question whether everything I had learned in medical school, everything I had published in medical journals, everything I had taught to the next generation of sports medicine physicians was based on an incomplete and fundamentally flawed understanding of what the human body is truly capable of under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. This is the story of that case, and why it still haunts me every single day. The case I'm about to tell you about began long before I met the patient. It started on March 3rd, 2024, in the rugged mountain town of Vail, Colorado, about 90 miles west of Boulder. The town was hosting the annual Extreme Winter Sports Championship, a competition that attracts the most fearless and skilled athletes from around the world to compete in events that push the absolute boundaries of human capability and survival instinct. Sarah Chen Martinez was 28 years old and had been competing in extreme skiing for 12 years. She wasn't just any athlete, she was a 3-time X Games gold medalist, a 2-time Olympic bronze medalist in freestyle skiing, and held the world record for the steepest slope successfully skied at a mind-bending 78-degree angle. Sarah had grown up in Aspen, the daughter of a Chinese-American ski instructor father and a Mexican-American former Olympic snowboarder mother. Skiing wasn't just in her blood, it was her blood. Sarah stood 5'4" inches with the compact, powerful build typical of elite skiers. But what set her apart wasn't her physical attributes, it was her absolute fearlessness and her uncanny ability to read mountain terrain in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Other athletes called her La Muerte Blanca, the White Death, not because she was dangerous to others, but because she danced with death on every run, and somehow always emerged victorious. She had survived crashes that killed other skiers, conquered slopes that had been declared unskiable by mountain authorities, and pioneered techniques that were being studied by sports scientists around the world. Sarah's runs weren't just athletic performances, they were physics-defying art forms that left spectators wondering if they had witnessed something that violated the laws of gravity and momentum. On that early March morning, Sarah was attempting something that no human being had ever successfully completed, skiing down the notorious Devil's Spine, a 85-degree slope on the backside of Vail Mountain that had been closed to all skiing for over 30 years due to multiple fatalities. The slope was essentially a vertical wall of ice and rock with a 800-foot vertical drop that ended in a field of jagged granite boulders the size of automobiles. The attempt wasn't officially sanctioned. Sarah had obtained unofficial permission from mountain authorities who knew her reputation and trusted her judgment more than their own safety protocols. She had spent 3 weeks studying the slope, analyzing weather patterns, snow conditions, and mapping every rock outcropping and potential hazard. Her support team included her husband and coach Miguel Martinez, a former Olympic snowboarder himself, along with a camera crew documenting what they hoped would be either the greatest skiing achievement in history or Sarah's final ride. The conditions that morning were perfect in every measurable way. Fresh powder over a solid base, temperatures in the ideal range for snow consistency, minimal wind, and crystal clear visibility that allowed Sarah to see every detail of the slope she was about to descend. Her equipment had been inspected and re-inspected, custom titanium skis designed specifically for this attempt, bindings that had been stress tested beyond any normal parameters, and a specialized suit equipped with impact sensors and GPS tracking. At exactly 9:47 a.m. Mountain Time, Sarah pushed off from the summit staging area. For the first 800 feet, everything went exactly as planned. Her technique was flawless, her speed controlled, her line perfect. The camera crew captured footage that would later be analyzed frame by frame by sports scientists who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. A human being skiing down what was essentially a cliff face with the grace and precision of a dancer. What happened next occurred in less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds would fundamentally alter everything I thought I knew about human survival, the limits of medical intervention, and the nature of life itself. At approximately 1,200 feet into her descent, Traveling at an estimated 95 miles per hour, Sarah hit a patch of ice that had been invisible from above. The ice was created by an underground spring that had been slowly seeping through a crack in the rock face, creating a perfectly smooth, nearly frictionless surface about 8 feet wide and 12 feet long. When Sarah's skis hit this ice patch, the laws of physics took over with devastating efficiency. Her skis lost all grip instantly, sending her into an uncontrolled tumble at nearly 100 miles per hour. The impact sensors in her suit recorded forces that should have been instantly fatal, rotational acceleration that exceeded anything survivable, impacts that generated G-forces beyond what human tissue can withstand. Sarah's body ragdolled down the remaining 1,600 feet of the slope, striking rock outcroppings, ice formations, and finally the boulder field at the bottom with impacts that were later calculated to exceed the force of a head-on collision between two vehicles traveling at highway speeds. The entire fall lasted 47 seconds and was captured in horrifying detail by multiple cameras positioned at various points along the slope. Miguel, her husband and coach, reached her location within 6 minutes using a snowmobile equipped with medical supplies. What he found should have been a corpse. Sarah was lying motionless in a crater-like depression in the snow, surrounded by pieces of her shattered equipment and rocks that had been dislodged during her fall. Her specialized helmet had been completely destroyed, existing now only as fragments of carbon fiber and foam scattered across a 30-foot radius. But impossibly, Miguel found a pulse, weak, irregular, barely detectable, but undeniably present. Sarah was breathing, if you could call the shallow, sporadic gasps that barely moved her chest, breathing. Her eyes were open but completely unresponsive, staring at the sky with the fixed gaze that every emergency responder recognizes as a sign of severe traumatic brain injury. The helicopter evacuation took 23 minutes during which Sarah's vital signs fluctuated between barely detectable and completely absent. The flight paramedics, both veterans with decades of experience in mountain rescue operations, later said they had never transported a patient with injuries that severe who wasn't already dead. They performed emergency intubation, started multiple IV lines, and administered medications to maintain her blood pressure and heart rhythm, but privately, they were convinced they were simply delaying the inevitable. Sarah arrived at Meridian Peak Medical Center at 11:43 a.m., and I was called in immediately as the consulting sports medicine specialist due to my extensive experience with high-impact trauma cases. When I first saw her in the emergency department, I was convinced that this was going to be one of those tragic cases where families needed help understanding that sometimes the human body simply cannot survive the forces that had been applied to it. Her initial imaging studies revealed injuries that were, in medical terms, incompatible with life. Sarah had sustained a traumatic brain injury, so severe that 40% of her brain tissue showed signs of irreversible damage. Her skull had multiple fractures that created what looked like a spider web pattern across her entire cranium. Her cervical spine was fractured in 3 places, with bone fragments displaced in ways that should have severed her spinal cord completely. But the head and neck injuries, devastating as they were, weren't even the worst of it. Sarah's thoracic cage had been essentially crushed, 11 ribs broken in multiple places, her sternum cracked vertically, both lungs collapsed, her heart showing signs of severe contusion from the repeated impacts. Her left arm was hanging by soft tissue connections only. The humerus, radius, and ulna had been shattered into so many fragments that our orthopedic surgeons initially couldn't identify all the pieces. Her abdominal organs had been subjected to deceleration forces that tore her liver in half, ruptured her spleen completely, and caused internal bleeding that was quickly becoming life-threatening, despite our attempts to maintain her blood volume with transfusions. Her pelvis was fractured in 6 places, and both of her legs showed compound fractures so severe that bone fragments were protruding through her skin. Elizabeth Nakamura, our chief of emergency medicine and a physician with 25 years of trauma experience, pulled me aside within an hour of Sarah's arrival. "Adrienne," she said quietly, "I've seen a lot of people die in this department, but I've never seen someone this badly injured who was still technically alive. Her injuries are beyond what any human being can survive, regardless of our intervention. The family is flying in from Aspen, and they're going to need someone to help them understand that we're looking at comfort care only." I agreed with Dr. Nakamura's assessment completely. Based on everything I knew about human anatomy, trauma physiology, and the limits of medical intervention, Sarah Chen Martinez should have died on that mountain. The fact that she had survived the helicopter transport was in itself medically inexplicable. The idea that she could survive the next few hours, let alone make any kind of meaningful recovery, was beyond impossible. It was contrary to every principle of medicine I had learned in over 2 decades of practice. Sarah's family arrived that evening. Her parents, her 2 younger brothers, Miguel, and what seemed like half of the international skiing community. The waiting room looked like a gathering of Olympic athletes, X-Games champion, and skiing legends who had flown in from around the world to say goodbye to someone they considered not just a fellow athlete, but a pioneer who had pushed their sport into territories that no one else dared to explore. I spent over an hour that night explaining Sarah's injuries to her family, using anatomical models, imaging studies, and careful, gentle language to help them understand the reality of the situation. Miguel, her husband, was a former athlete himself and understood the medical terminology better than most. "Dr. Blackwood," he said, his voice breaking with exhaustion and grief, "are you telling us that Sarah is going to die?" I chose my words carefully, drawing on 2 decades of experience delivering impossible news to families who were facing the unthinkable. "Miguel, Sarah's injuries are more severe than anything I have seen in 21 years of practice. Her brain injury alone would typically be considered unsurvivable. Combined with the damage to her spine, her chest, her internal organs, and her limbs, we are looking at a situation where her body has sustained more trauma than medical science can repair. But she's still alive," said her mother Elena, a woman who had competed in 2 Olympics herself and understood better than most what the human body was capable of enduring. "As long as she's alive, there's hope, right? There's something you can do." I had delivered this type of news hundreds of times before, but something about Sarah's case felt different in ways I couldn't articulate. Maybe it was the extent of the injuries combined with the fact that she had somehow survived them this long. Maybe it was the family's obvious devotion and the international attention the case was already attracting. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a nagging feeling that I was missing something important, something that would only become clear much later. "Elena," I said finally, "we are going to do everything that medical science allows us to do. But I need you and your family to understand that even if Sarah survives the next few days, which would require what could only be described as a miracle, the likelihood of any meaningful recovery is essentially 0. The brain injury alone would leave her in a persistent vegetative state at best. Combined with her other injuries, we are looking at a situation where the person you knew as Sarah would not exist anymore, even if her body somehow survived." The family made the decision to proceed with aggressive treatment. Over the next 72 hours, Sarah underwent 7 different surgical procedures. Neurosurgeons worked to relieve pressure on her brain and remove bone fragments from her skull. Orthopedic surgeons spent 14 hours reconstructing her limbs using titanium rods, plates, and screws that essentially replaced more bone than they reinforced. Thoracic surgeons repaired her heart, reinflated her lungs, and reconstructed her chest cavity using experimental techniques that had never been attempted on injuries this severe. Throughout all of this, Sarah remained completely unresponsive. Her brain activity, as measured by continuous EEG monitoring, showed patterns consistent with severe vegetative state. Her eyes remained open but tracked nothing. She showed no response to pain, no voluntary movements, no sign that the person who had been called La Morte Blanca still existed anywhere inside the broken body we were desperately trying to repair. 2 weeks after her accident, Sarah was transferred to our long-term care unit. The diagnosis was persistent vegetative state with catastrophic multi-system trauma. Her condition had stabilized to the extent that she was no longer in immediate danger of death, but there was no evidence of conscious awareness or any realistic possibility of meaningful recovery. This is where I truly entered Sarah's story as her primary attending physician, and where everything I thought I knew about human physiology, consciousness, and the boundaries between life and death would be challenged in ways I never could have imagined. Because what happened next would force me to question everything.